Hi, I'm Andrew from Deakin University, and today I'm going to talk about a large-scale comparative analysis of coding standard conformance in open source data science projects. What we did is we took projects from GitHub, then ran them through Pilot, a Python code quality analysis tool, to see whether or not data science projects follow good software engineering coding standards. Now, if you've worked on a data science project before, or just for that matter written research code, you probably know what I mean when I say it's not typically the best quality from a software engineering perspective, and the code tends to get quite messy. But rather than leaving it as just something anecdotally observed from personal experience, the aim of this study was to run a large-scale analysis to see whether or not we could find empirical evidence of this at scale, and to better understand how data science code differs to traditional software code. Firstly, we needed a corpus of data science projects. But rather than reinventing our own, we started with an existing corpus of high-quality projects from a paper in Mining Software Repositories 2019. But the issue is, to answer our research question, it's not enough just to study the data science projects, because I can tell you straight away, if you were to pick a random project from GitHub, it's not necessarily going to be the best example of software engineering. So in order to understand how data science projects are different, we also needed to create a corpus of traditional software engineering projects. So to do this, we took the original query used to construct the data science corpus, inverted the terms, and selected basically all the projects on GitHub that weren't related to data science. But we still set the same filters for quality level in terms of the number of stars, and also still limiting to Python. Another issue we faced in this was that data science is a quite recent phenomenon, which means it wouldn't make sense to compare a recent data science project to a traditional software project that could potentially be up to 30 years old. So to deal with this, we introduced an age threshold and only took the more recent non-data science projects. The goal being to establish a set of data science projects and non-data science projects with more or less the same quality in terms of number of stars, and more or less the same maturity in terms of age and the dates they were created. In the end, we ended up with a corpus of a little over 1,000 data science projects and another 1,000 projects that were more traditional software engineering projects. So, moving on to the main question, how does the adherence to coding standards differ between data science projects compared to traditional projects? To answer this, we ran both corpuses through Pilot, the Python code quality checking tool, which runs hundreds of different checks. Most of these are quite mundane, related to code quality from a conformance perspective, so whether or not it follows the Python style guidelines. Others are more around code smells, so checking for things that aren't quite right. The most significant differences found were in too many locals and too many arguments in the top there, which represent functions with an excessive number of variables in the body, so more than 15, or an excessive number of parameters. To interpret these are survival plots. So on the x-axis, what you're seeing is the number of warnings flagged per line of code, and on the y-axis is the fraction of projects that have at least that many violations. All you really need to know is to the top right is worse. So the data science projects in blue there had many more violations per lines of code than the non-data science projects in terms of functions with excessive numbers of variables or parameters, which makes sense. In data science projects, dealing with machine learning is quite algorithmic, so there'll be a lot of variables involved in the implementation, and often machine learning will involve hyperparameters used to adjust the search for the best model, and they'll all end up as parameters in the function, explaining why we're seeing functions with these excessive numbers of parameters. Down the bottom, we also found that invalid name warnings were also one of the most significant differences between data science projects and non-data science projects, which represent cases where projects are using, for example, short single-letter variable names rather than more expressive names, or, for example, using uppercase letters for variables that aren't a constant. Now, when we looked at a sample of the errors that Pylint had caught, we saw that it was data science projects that were implementing code from papers. So what would happen is if the paper's using mathematical notation to implement some algorithm, so for example they might use a variable called uppercase k, then that's what it will be in the Python implementation. There'll literally be a variable called k, and in uppercase whether or not it's really a constant. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. It makes sense that in your data science code you'd want your variables to match cleanly to the paper. However, it does represent a deviation from traditional software engineering coding practices. Drilling down, we then wanted to look at where these coding standards violations are occurring within the data science projects. So for this, we took larger data science projects, which are going to have some core data science functionality where the machine learning occurs, but also surrounding code to support it usually, and unit tests. Along the top, what we can see is that for the too many locals and too many arguments warnings dealing with the excessive number of variables in function definitions and parameters, it was mainly confined to just the very core data science modules of the data science projects, so the ones that were actually importing data science libraries, but not so much the surrounding code or unit tests. In contrast, down the bottom there, for the invalid name warnings, where we were dealing with, for example, the short variable names or not following conventions for constants. What's interesting is it's not confined just to the core data science parts of data science projects where the machine learning libraries are being imported, but also in surrounding code, so unit tests and even modules within the data science project that aren't directly using data science libraries at all. These invalid name warnings are just spread throughout the entire project. So that's something interesting for projects where there's data scientists and software engineers working together. For some types of coding violations, they're going to be confined just to the data science modules. But for others, you can expect it to be spread throughout the entire code base. So your software engineers are going to have to at least be aware of that when working together with data scientists. So in conclusion, we found empirical evidence that definitely shows that data science projects differ in coding standards compared to traditional software engineering projects. And what's more, these differences aren't subtle. So in some cases, it's almost twice as many coding violations per lines of code in the data science project compared to the traditional software projects. That said, I'm not necessarily saying that these violations are without reason. So as future work, what we want to do is, now that we know that there's differences between data science and traditional software projects, to see if we can develop software linting tools that are better tailored to the needs of data science projects and enforce coding standards that actually matter to data scientists